Hotel, India, Echo, Lima, Delta,
August the 5th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe is found dead in her Los Angeles home. The coroner decides that it was probable suicide. The verdict seemed plausible. Hollywood's most glamorous star was known as a party girl and a drug user. But right from the start, the verdict has been questioned. Recently, an old rumor has found new life. The claim that on the last night of her life, she had a confrontation with a man the official reports had never mentioned.
He said, you know, you better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. I know what's good for me. I'm Marilyn Monroe.
She was screaming, "Get out, get out." She didn't want to see him again. Her world was really beginning to unravel that night.
The violent confrontation ends with Marilyn's murder. If true, these events destroy the reputation of one of the most revered politicians of his generation.
Was he capable of murdering Marilyn Monroe or being complicit with it? That's a major allegation. It's shocking.
Now, missing evidence from lost tapes and eyewitness interviews tell a very different story of the death of Marilyn Monroe. The 4th of August, 1962. Marilyn Monroe is spending what would turn out to be her final day alive in her exclusive Brentwood property. According to the Los Angeles Police Department's death report, this is the timeline of the hours leading to Marilyn's death. 7 p.m. Marilyn calls her movie star friend Peter Lawford. As brother-in-law to John Kennedy, Lawford had introduced Marilyn to the president. Marilyn was supposed to have dinner at Lawford's house, but she cancelled. Instead, she went to bed early at 8 p.m. Around midnight, housekeeper Eunice Murray says a light was on in Marilyn's bedroom. By 3:30 a.m., the light is still on and the door locked. The worried housekeeper calls Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's longtime psychiatrist. He comes immediately and breaks into her room. The most glamorous woman in Hollywood lies nude, face down on the bed. At 3:50 a.m., she is officially pronounced dead. 35 minutes later, Dr. Greenson reports Marilyn's death to the LAPD. Just hours later, at 10:30 a.m., the official autopsy report declares that the cause of death was probable suicide. In the coroner's opinion, Marilyn had apparently died by taking lethal amounts of sleeping pills. And considering her emotional history, it seemed a reasonable conclusion. Though she was adored for being voluptuous, funny, and vulnerable, Marilyn Monroe was a great star with a very troubled past. She was born Norma Jean Mortensen, an orphan child of Hollywood. Her mother, a Hollywood film technician, was mentally unstable. Her father, a drifter who abandoned them both. Marilyn went in and out of more than a dozen foster homes. But the orphan bloomed into a young model turned Hollywood starlet. Entertaining the troops in Korea swept her to true stardom. Chris Epting is an author and journalist with a special interest in the Marilyn Monroe story.
She was extremely ambitious, extremely focused on what she wanted, and very mercurial about it. And that's what I think really drove her in her young adulthood, was that idea, that hunger for success and fame and popularity. She didn't have a mother and father necessarily giving her moral rights and wrongs or anything like that. She was strictly focused on the prize.
Marilyn was drawn to powerful men, and they were drawn to her. She married Joe DiMaggio, the nation's top baseball player, then Arthur Miller, America's leading playwright.
She was a magnet for smart, intelligent, powerful men. They were all drawn to her, and they all kind of came away with different pieces of her. And I think ultimately they left very little, and what was there, you know, couldn't survive the pressures of everyday life.
Mr. President, Marilyn Monroe.
Marilyn became notorious for her many affairs. But her most remarkable conquests were rumored to be the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and his brother, Robert.
Imagine if today it was Angelina Jolie having an affair with Barack Obama and the Attorney General, right? You know, I mean, this is almost unthinkable.
The son of a wardrobe mistress, Darwin Porter grew up in the company of Hollywood stars and Washington insiders, and has written biographies of many Hollywood giants, including Marilyn Monroe.
I used to work for Senator George Smathers of Florida, who called himself John F. Kennedy's best friend, and I think he was. And he talked about it all the time, so I was very early hearing about this affair.
Her appearance at JFK's 45th birthday celebrations may have been the first time the public guessed at their affair. Professor Robert Watson specializes in the history of the presidency. He thinks the rumors ring true.
Kennedy was absolutely reckless. I mean, it was not uncommon for him to have multiple different women a week while in the White House. Who had time to govern? One's liable to ask. He prostitutes, secretaries. He had an affair with this teenage intern at the White House, and this we're very confident on. So Kennedy could be extremely reckless. Does that mean he had the affair with Marilyn Monroe? No. Does it mean it's possible, even probable he did? Yes. It fits the bill.
By 1961, Marilyn seemed to be riding high. But the truth was more tragic. After 3 divorces, 3 miscarriages, and countless broken affairs, she suffered from serial rejection. Marilyn fell in and out of psychiatric clinics, ever more reliant on pills to keep her going.
She couldn't sleep at night. She would wash down the pills with champagne. It was difficult to get her to wake up in the mornings.
Marilyn's private troubles spilled over into her professional life. She became so unreliable that 20th Century Fox fired her off her final film, appropriately called Something's Got to Give. After her Hollywood studio rejected her, those close to Marilyn said she looked to the president to commit to their relationship.
She had it in her head, in this maybe slightly drug-addled and booze-addled head, that he was going to leave his wife for her, the First Lady, and that Marilyn maybe would become the First Lady. I mean, it's kind of out there, to say the very least.
Recent biographies assert that Marilyn's ambition alarmed the president. He stopped returning her calls. Close friends claim that the rejection drove Marilyn to threaten to go public with their affair, a threat that would ultimately lead to her death. The last weekend of July 1962, Marilyn's increasingly erratic behavior was coming to a head. She joined friends at the Cal Naval Lodge on the border between California and Nevada. Many claimed that the threat she made at the lodge would lead to her death. That weekend, singer Buddy Greco was the headline act. He was playing to a room of the most powerful men in the entertainment and criminal worlds.
Of course, Frank Sinatra was there, and Sammy was there. Sam Giancana was there. Tony Lima. The list just went on and on and on.
Sam Giancana was the mafia's boss of bosses, the top gangster in America. But that weekend, all eyes were on Marilyn Monroe and her very public meltdown.
One evening she came to see me perform and walked through the door, and the place was jam-packed. And the next thing I knew, this woman walked in and the place just stopped, like the world stopped. Nothing was said. Everybody just stopped. And she got out and she said, "Why are all these effing people looking at me?" And I think somebody shouted, "Because you're Marilyn Monroe." That's a pretty good reason, right?
She was not well that weekend. The poor woman should have been in a clinic. She was drugged and she was drinking and she was really coming unglued. It was the beginning of the end for her.
In her confused and emotional state, there are claims that Marilyn made a very public threat against the most powerful family in the United States.
There is a moment here at the Cal Naval Lodge the week before she died where Marilyn, in an angry rant, vowed to have a press conference to expose the Kennedys. That set off sirens, as you can imagine, all over the place. This is a woman who now understands she does control some of the power, and she's deciding whether or not to go public with it.
Within days, Marilyn would be found dead from an apparent overdose of sleeping pills. But if recent evidence is true, then Monroe didn't take her own life. She was sacrificed to preserve a political dynasty. In fact, the suspicions that Marilyn had been murdered started before her body had even reached the hands of the coroner. The official story has it that at 3:50 Marilyn was pronounced dead. 35 minutes later, at 4:25, the Los Angeles Police Department received their first call. At 4:45 a.m., LAPD Sergeant Jack Clemens, a veteran of 15 years, is the first police officer on the scene. Clemens questioned Marilyn's housekeeper, but found her vague and possibly evasive. Clemens described how Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, was keen to tell him what had happened that night.
Dr. Greenson, he pointed out to me that on a nightstand by her bed there was about 8 prescription bottles, and they were all empty. And I could still see the man as he stood there, and he goes like this: "She must have taken all of these."
Clemens didn't believe that Marilyn had taken an overdose. There was no glass or water to swallow all the pills. The caps were neatly placed on the bottles. The body looked staged on the bed. Sergeant Clemens' suspicions led him to a disturbing conclusion.
Marilyn Monroe did not commit suicide. She was murdered.
Clemens' opinion was dismissed, but over the years, other people close to the case have come to agree with him. The autopsy found that Marilyn's death was probable suicide. But in his biography, the man who did the autopsy, coroner's assistant Thomas Noguchi, entered the debate. He wrote, "The sheer number of pills Monroe ingested was too many to swallow accidentally." He found absolutely no visual evidence of pills in the stomach or the small intestine. And if Marilyn hadn't either accidentally or deliberately overdosed, the only conceivable cause of Monroe's death was murder. Although Noguchi stuck to his initial conclusion of probable suicide, the rumors of murder persisted. But who killed her? In 1998, Jeff Platts recorded a telephone conversation with his uncle, George Masters, Marilyn Monroe's personal hairdresser. Masters claimed that only 24 hours before she died, Marilyn Monroe had been summoned to a meeting with the mafia boss, Sam Giancana.
The night before she died.
Yeah, in Lake Tahoe.
In Lake Tahoe?
At the Cal Naval Lodge.
At the what? The Cal?
Cal Naval Lodge in Lake Tahoe.
Okay. And what were the circumstances?
Well, she was there with Sam Giancana,
Okay.
who was the head of the mafia.
Wow.
On the basis of his uncle's revelation, Platts believes that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, did a deal with the mafia to stop Marilyn Monroe exposing her affair with President Kennedy, a revelation that could bring down the presidency.
Marilyn was getting ready to go public with her affair with John F. Kennedy. And Bobby was intervening. He called Sam Giancana, and he made a deal with him. He said, look, if you quiet down Marilyn, stop her from doing this, I'm going to back off on our prosecutions of the mafia. So Sam Giancana had Marilyn come up there, and I believe it was to try and talk some sense into her, like a last-ditch effort. And then that failed, and so then the final solution was to have her killed.
But would the Attorney General really do a deal with the mafia boss?
Bobby Kennedy and Sam Giancana hated each other. Bobby Kennedy was threatening to destroy him.
Could silencing Marilyn be the price the mafia paid to get the Attorney General off their backs? Journalist Chris Epting broke the George Masters story. But having further researched the claim that Marilyn returned to Cal Neva, he now has serious doubts.
When I first heard the George Masters tape, I got really excited. The more I looked into it, though, it completely fell apart. A pilot would have had to have been booked. People would have seen her at the airport. People would have seen her here at the lodge. There is no notice of that, no press notice, nobody in the casino, nobody places her here firsthand.
Rather than being in Cal Neva, evidence points to Marilyn being in Los Angeles the day before she died.
On that Friday, she had dinner with her good friend, Pat Newcomb, and Peter Lawford. She was seen publicly in a restaurant. She was heard from at home on the telephone. There's a lot of compelling physical evidence that placed her at home on that Friday.
Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, also confirmed that Marilyn slept at home that night. Ruskin also believes that Marilyn was more valuable to the mafia alive than dead.
Not only there's no evidence for this, why would they want to do this? They've basically got something that they can use against the Kennedys.
Marilyn Monroe was the ultimate weapon for Sam Giancana to use against the Kennedys. He had every reason to keep her alive. Why would he think for a moment of having her rubbed out?
If the mafia didn't kill Marilyn, who did? Central to many theories is the claim that in the hours before her death, she had a very important visit, a visit from the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. The official timeline of the last day of Marilyn Monroe's life makes no mention of a visit by Kennedy. Despite being the most important lawman in America, rumors that Bobby had been seen at Marilyn's home started within hours of her death. The Kennedys have always denied that Bobby was in Los Angeles. They maintain that he was at a friend's home in Gilroy, just outside of San Francisco. Someone wasn't telling the truth. So what evidence is there to support this highly controversial claim? For one, the mayor of Los Angeles has always said that he was unofficially briefed by his chief of police.
Chief Parker told me confidentially that Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be north of Los Angeles, some city, making a speech, but that actually he said he was seen in the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles.
I think there is clear and compelling evidence that places Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles, not just the night of Marilyn Monroe's death, but the day as well. You have upwards 18 eyewitnesses. You've got a neighbor of Peter Lawford seeing him. You've got a neighbor of Marilyn Monroe seeing him.
Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, for many years never said anything about it, but in 1985 suddenly came out with the fact that categorically Bobby was at Marilyn's house that day.
Historian Robert Watson believes that on balance the evidence is worthy of consideration.
You don't just have one eyewitness, you have multiple. So to me, that passes a threshold to suggest that Bobby Kennedy was there.
Why would Bobby Kennedy be there? Probably to talk Marilyn out of going public about their relationship. But there was something else. Close friends to Marilyn claim that she kept a journal, a potentially incendiary memoir that has become known as her Red Diary.
First of all, according, to Marilyn, this would have logged all the details of her affair with the president. And so that would have just blown everything wide open. If she's threatening that she's going to go public with this Red Diary in a press conference for the whole world to know, this would have been dynamite.
The existence of the diary is controversial.
Many critics have challenged the fact that Marilyn Monroe did not keep the Red Diary, the famous Red Diary, that allegedly no one has ever seen. But there are many people close to Marilyn who did see the diary, including her masseur, who bought it with her on the streets of Manhattan in a stationery store.
Now, this man says he has evidence that not only corroborates the diary, but also shatters the official version of Marilyn's death. Ray Straight claims to have listened to tape recordings of Bobby Kennedy inside Marilyn's house on the day she died.
First I heard on the tape was the housekeeper let him in. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Kennedy, she's been sleeping." And he said, "Well, I need to talk to her."
For many years, Hollywood insider Ray Straight was a press agent to stars like Jane Mansfield. Ray's friend, Fred Otash, was a notorious character in Hollywood. He made a living collecting the dirt on the famous and powerful.
Let me tell you about Fred. He was big and burly, bear-like, and everybody was scared of him. And, Fred mixed with mobsters and politicians. It didn't matter to him.
Fred Otash's speciality was bugging. He worked with a coterie of eavesdroppers, in particular a sound technician named Bernie Spindell. In 1962, the goings-on in Marilyn's house were of interest to a lot of high-profile clients. One was the head of the Teamsters Union, Jimmy Hoffa, as Otash admits in this 1985 interview.
What Hoffa wanted was me to assist Bernie Spindell in developing a derogatory profile on Jack and Bobby Kennedy and their relationships with Marilyn Monroe.
Well, it was well known that Jimmy Hoffa hated the Kennedys, and especially Bobby or Jack or anyone. He always looking to get dirt on them. So Hoffa, he offered Fred a deal, and a very big deal, plenty of money, if he could wire everywhere that the Kennedy boys went.
Otash maintained that besides Hoffa, another of his clients was the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Professor Watson believes the claim is credible.
Were they bugging Marilyn Monroe? Possibly. They bugged a lot of people in Hollywood. Hoover was interested from a professional and a personal reason. He was a bizarre fellow in John F. Kennedy's sexual affairs.
That would have been absolute dynamite in the hands of J. Edgar, who hated the Kennedys because they were trying to restrict his power. And so that would have been one really good reason there to bug Marilyn's house. As solid as it gets.
Well, it's hardly any secret today that Marilyn's house in Brentwood was bugged like it was the nerve center of the Soviet Union.
Ray Straight recalls how he came to listen to the Otash tapes that contained the explosive details of Marilyn's last hours alive.
In 1986, I got a call from Fred. He said, "Can you come down to the desert?" So I went down. He was staying at a friend's house down in Palm Springs. And after dinner, we had some drinks. He said, "Come in at dinner. I want you to see. You got time?" I said, "Yeah." "All night?" He said, "Well, that's what it's going to take." And for 11 hours, I listened to reel tapes of Marilyn Monroe.
The very existence of the Otash Spindell tapes has been questioned. But as this New York Times article of 1966 shows, when the authorities later seized Spindell's tapes, he filed for their return. It is difficult to believe that Spindell would demand the return of tapes that did not exist. Equally, Bobby Kennedy's name was never mentioned in any official report or inquest at the time. But Marilyn made no secret of her relationship with him. Though by what she told her friends, Marilyn may have had unrealistic expectations.
She told friends like Jean Carmen that Bobby had proposed marriage to her over pillow talk. Now, Miss Carmen was a very sophisticated, hip woman, and she said, oh, Marilyn, don't believe that. If he said it, he didn't mean it. She said, but I know Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy will never leave Ethel and his wife and the children.
The alternative timeline starts at 2:30 p.m. when Bobby Kennedy arrived with Peter Lawford at Marilyn's home.
On the tapes, I heard Robert Kennedy, the first time he came to Marilyn's house, was early in the afternoon, and that was very amiable visit. They were having a good time drinking, and I think they were doing a little bit of smooching that sounded like smooches, but, you know, sounds can be deceiving.
Another man to have claimed to have heard the tapes was one of Otash's operatives, Milo Spirilio. He told Darwin Porter what happened next.
And then when it picks up again in the living room, he got really nitty-gritty with her, and he told her that he had to leave her, that too many people were watching them, Hoover, the FBI, Hoffa, and she was never to call him again. And it was Marilyn who was heard on tape ordering him out of the house. She was screaming, get out, get out. She didn't want to see him again. Her world was really beginning to unravel that night.
Get the hell out of my house. That was Marilyn.
In this version of the events, Kennedy and Lawford leave, but Marilyn's threat to go public is still very real.
So, talk about a woman scorned. She's been scorned by these brothers, and she's got the goods on them, basically.
She knew too much and made too many threats, and whether or not she would have followed through with them, they couldn't risk it.
When Bobby Kennedy left Marilyn's house at 2:30 in the afternoon, she was very much alive. But according to the Otash tapes, Bobby would return to look for the infamous Red Diary. According to the Marilyn biographer Richard Buskin, at 9:45 that evening, eyewitnesses saw Kennedy return.
We have a neighbor who had 3 women friends with her, and they were playing bridge. They all saw Bobby go into the house.
Marilyn was on the phone to Mexican screenwriter Jose Bolaños. He recalled how the conversation ended.
She heard some noise coming from the guest cottage, so she said, I'll be back, I'm just going to check this out. She never did come back on the line.
Ray Straight claims to have heard a confrontation on the Otash tapes between Marilyn and Kennedy, and 2 of his aides searching for her Red Diary in the guest house.
So Marilyn comes into the scene, you can hear her, and she's been drinking, and her voice was kind of slurred. She wanted to know, what are you back here for? I thought you were leaving. And they had a conversation, and she said, oh, you people just use me. That's all you want to do is just use me. You don't care about me. You just use me, and I'm tired of being used. Those were her exact words. I'm tired of being used. And let me tell you something, Buster. What I know would make the headlines. And Kennedy told her, Bobby Kennedy told her, he said, you know, you better keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. I know what's good for me. I'm Marilyn Monroe, and you're not messing. She didn't use the word messing. She used the F word with some extra here. And he says, I know who I'm dealing with, but you don't know who you're dealing with.
Marilyn got really hysterical with Bobby. Then Otash heard Bobby saying, give her something to calm her down, which is when things really turn to the dark side in this story.
You could hear them smother. Be careful with the pillow. Watch out for the shot. And I'm not sure if that was somebody be giving a shot or what was going on, but it was obviously that she was being smothered.
Now that Marilyn has been sedated, Bobby and his henchmen basically are free to ransack Marilyn's house. And so they start rifling through everything, looking manically, frantically for this red diary. By 10:30, they've turned up nothing. So now they're really desperate, and mostly wondering what they're going to do next.
Supporters of this version of events conclude that Kennedy left the house without the diary, and that Marilyn was unconscious but still alive. She and her red diary were a very real danger to the Kennedys.
Around 10:35, Eunice Murray reappears at Marilyn's home with Marilyn's handyman. They see Marilyn lying there, comatose, basically, at which point they do the right thing. They contact an ambulance, and they also contact Dr. Greenson.
Ralph Greenson was one of the most respected psychiatrists in America. The man Marilyn relied on more than anyone in the world. But before Greenson could get there, an ambulance crew stationed just a couple of minutes away were the first on the scene. Ambulance man James Hall becomes a key witness to the crucial events that follow.
An ambulance driver with his partner, James Hall, suddenly enters the scene on the night of Marilyn's murder. Once he got there, he found Marilyn still alive in the guest cottage, and he tried to resuscitate her.
James Hall didn't see a copy of the autopsy report until 1982. When he did, he realized to his horror that the report didn't match his memory of the events. He began to think he'd been a witness to murder.
Sort of tube down her throat, and according to James Hall's later testimony, color started coming back to her face. She was reviving.
Just as Marilyn was coming round, Hall says her psychoanalyst Ralph Greenson arrived and took over, some 4 hours before the time he would admit to arriving in the official report.
Dr. Greenson shows up and instantly announces that they've got to stop the resuscitation. He opens his case and pulls out a hypodermic syringe with this absolutely huge heart needle. I mean, no doctor, no psychiatrist would be walking around with that kind of equipment in his bag. It just doesn't happen.
James Hall says that 3 people then arrived. Peter Lawford, Bobby's brother-in-law, Pat Newcomb, Marilyn's publicist, and LA detective Marvin Iannone, an LAPD officer who had worked closely with Bobby in the past.
The ambulance attendant, James Hall, is presuming that the shot that Dr. Greenson's about to administer is actually adrenaline to revive her. What he's really perturbed by is the manner in which it's administered.
In this 1992 interview, James Hall recounts what Dr. Greenson did next.
He took a pharmaceutical bottle out of his doctor's bag that's kind of a little rubber stopper on the top, and filled the syringe from that, and he counted down the rib cage, pushed her breast to the side, and stuck the needle into her chest. Although he did it wrong, it was at an angle, and the needle stopped. Instead of backing it out and starting over, he just leaned on it, and it went snap, and it broke her rib. And he just shoved it right into her heart.
Hall maintains that within a few moments, Marilyn Monroe was dead.
And then the doctor put the stethoscope on her chest and said, you can leave, I'm going to pronounce her dead. And I was sick. I mean, we had her saved. So.
If true, Hall's allegations are deeply shocking. From the moment he first made them, Hall was dismissed as an attention seeker. Yet throughout his life, he stuck to his story.
Something I'd like to add about James Hall. is that he's the only one of the eyewitnesses who took polygraph tests. He actually took 14 polygraph tests, and he passed every single one with flying colours. So again, this adds credence to his story that he witnessed Dr. Greenson murdering Marilyn Monroe.
He passed every test. I know that's not conclusive, but everybody else was lying. And the thing about Hall, he didn't have any reason to lie. He didn't know Marilyn. He wasn't connected with her. And I believe his testimony.
Many of the eyewitnesses to Marilyn's death stayed quiet at the time. But once the Kennedy brothers were dead, their stories changed.
Independently, they all moved in that direction towards the fact that Marilyn Monroe had been murdered. And why would they have not said that in 1962? The reasons are clear: reprisals.
3 of the 5 people present that night eventually confirmed that Greenson was with Marilyn when she died. If Greenson did administer a fatal shot directly into Marilyn's heart, what possible reason could he have had for killing her? In the month before she died, Greenson and Marilyn saw one another every day. In his memoirs, Peter Lawford said that he had listened to an earlier tape recording that suggested that their relationship had gone beyond the strict boundaries between doctor and patient. Lawford said, "I heard what seemed to be sounds of their lovemaking, the voices of Marilyn Monroe and Dr. Ralph Greenson. You could hear the muted sounds of bed springs."
If that goes public, it could cost Greenson his license as a psychiatrist, probably cost him his marriage, and it could also put him behind bars, because that's criminal behavior to be having an affair with his client.
For years, Peter Lawford kept quiet. So why did he decide to tell all? Like Marilyn, Lawford eventually fell out of favor with the Kennedys. And when he did, he spoke out.
Apparently, Peter just could not keep the secret any longer, and he didn't feel it was right for there not to be a proper explanation for how Marilyn died. Marilyn Monroe was a friend of Peter Lawford's for more than 10 years, and he was an unwilling participant in her murder.
Lawford's second allegation was even more disturbing. Lawford said that he had heard Robert Kennedy call Dr. Greenson on the day Marilyn died. Lawford said, "Bobby called the good doctor and convinced him that his star patient also intended to disclose her romantic dealings with the psychiatrist. Marilyn has got to be silenced," Bobby told Greenson. Greenson had thus been set up by Bobby to take care of Marilyn. The Kennedys have always denied Lawford's accusations. But how would an historian assess the charge?
Bobby Kennedy could be remarkably ruthless and shrewd, I think alarmingly so. Was he capable of taking matters into his own hands and doing things that he probably shouldn't have done? He did it on a regular basis. Having said that, was he capable of murdering Marilyn Monroe? I just can't imagine. That's a major allegation. It's shocking.
But author J. Margolis claims to have evidence that adds weight to Lawford's allegation. It took Margolis 4 years of research to unearth this personal letter written by Dr. Greenson to a colleague. In it, Greenson regrets having feelings of countertransference toward Marilyn, a term he defines as including inappropriate sexual feelings.
Ralph Greenson himself admitted that he was becoming a victim of, quote, countertransference while he was treating Marilyn Monroe.
Margolis feels that this document supports both Peter Lawford and James Hall in their claim that Dr. Greenson killed Marilyn. He feels that the weight of evidence swings in favor of murder.
There were 5 eyewitnesses. 3 of the 5 state that Ralph Greenson was responsible. These 3 are Peter Lawford, James Hall, and Murray Leibowitz.
Murray Leibowitz was James Hall's ambulance driver. The other 2 witnesses to Marilyn's death, Sergeant Iannone and Pat Newcomb, have always refused to comment about the claims. Yet supporters of the Monroe murder story maintain that Dr. Greenson killed Marilyn under the influence of the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy. They also believe that the cover-up that followed her death was intended to save those men from discovery. The crucial hours were between 11:45, when it is claimed that Marilyn Monroe was killed, and 4:25 in the morning, when the police were finally informed.
You've got 4 or 5 hours there where chaos is breaking loose in that house. You've got the doctor, you've got Peter Lawford, you've got calls to the White House. You've got all of this going on because Bobby Kennedy knows his family's dynasty hangs in the balance.
First, Greenson and Lawford tried to get Bobby Kennedy safely out of Los Angeles, a claim attested to by a very credible witness.
At 12:10, a highly decorated Beverly Hills detective named Lynn Franklin pulls over a speeding car on Olympic Boulevard. It's going 70 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone. He goes to the car and finds at the wheel none other than Peter Lawford. Also, Marilyn's doctor, Ralph Greenson, is in the car, and in the back seat is Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Franklin questions Lawford. Lawford tells him that Kennedy is staying at the Beverly Hilton. So Franklin tells him, "You're going the wrong way." That's one thing. He doesn't know who Greenson is. He recognizes him later after learning about Marilyn's death.
Private Detective Fred Otash says that Lawford then appeared at his house.
Lawford showed up and completely disorientated and completely in a state of shock. One, saying that Marilyn Monroe was dead, Bobby Kennedy was there, that he was spirited out of town by some airplane back up north, that they had gotten in a big fight that evening, and that he'd like to have me make arrangements to have someone go out to the house and pick up any and all information that was possible regarding any involvement between Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys, whether it be diaries, whether they be notes, letters, etc.
Marilyn's housekeeper and her handyman eventually admitted that they saw Lawford back at Marilyn's home, helping to move her body back to the main house.
They saw Peter Lawford helping to drag Marilyn's body from the guest cottage back to the bedroom so that they could stage the scene instead of her being face up on, you know, which is how she'd been discovered by the ambulance men when they arrived at the house. Now she would be face down, naked on the bed. Why place Marilyn face down? Again, there was a good reason for this. It was so that the blood in her body would pool at the front of her body. Being face down, that's where it would pull, the gravity would pull it down, and that would help mask where the injection marks had been made. There would be no needle marks.
At 4:25 a.m., Dr. Greenson calls the police and reports Marilyn's death. At 4:45 a.m., Sergeant Jack Clemens arrives. He finds the housekeeper washing sheets. Under interrogation, he finds her vague and evasive. Clemens also feels that Marilyn's position on the bed looks staged. And although Dr. Greenson points to the empty bottles of sleeping pills and tells him that Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, he wonders why there's no glass of water to wash them down. Jack Clemens immediately suspects murder. Within the hour, other LAPD officers arrive.
After an hour of him being at that scene, he was replaced. And guess who he was replaced by? Sergeant Marvin Iannone, the man who had shown up with Peter Lawford and Pat Newcomb to witness the goings-on that night.
Marvin Iannone, Kennedy's go-to security man in Los Angeles, was now part of the investigation.
And all of a sudden now you've got such a massive cover-up going on that you have police involved who are good friends of Bobby Kennedy's.
Later that morning, Bobby Kennedy is seen with his family in Gilroy near San Francisco. The same morning in LA, the coroner declares Marilyn's death a probable suicide, only hours after her demise. When Assistant Coroner Thomas Noguchi requests toxicology tests to establish the precise details of her overdose, he is told her organ samples have been disposed of. When the district attorney's office tried to interview Peter Lawford about the events of the day, they are told he has left town. Whereabouts unknown. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, says she found the red diary and gave it to the coroner's office. The deputy coroner's aide insisted that a diary was handed to him and that he locked it in a safe overnight. But that the next day, the diary had disappeared. Then in 1982, the re-examination of the case rejected any possibility that the diary ever existed. Fred Otash hid the tapes that Ray Straight heard. But when Otash died, Straight claims that these too vanished.
When Fred died, the CIA or the FBI or both, he had a house in Hollywood, one in Miami, and one in Cannes. All three were immediately sealed and cleaned out. Everything Fred had.
50 years after her death, 2 boxes of Marilyn's letters and notes were found in the home of Marilyn's acting coach, Lee Strasberg. In them was a letter written just days before she died. She wrote, "As far as I'm concerned, the happiest time of my life is now. There's the future, and I can't wait to get to it."
A lot of people have suggested that Marilyn was terribly despondent, lacking love, fired from Fox, but actually she was on the dawn of her greatest breakthrough at the age of 36. Fox wanted to rehire her at an astronomical figure. Las Vegas wanted her at $100,000 a week. Offers were coming in.
You see how the story was turned around. It looked as if, well, she must have been suicidal. She'd been fired, her career was in tatters. It was actually the total opposite. But the studio didn't admit to that for many, many years.
By then, Marilyn's suicide had become the accepted story. 50 years on, and Marilyn's death continues to raise legitimate questions. If the events played out on the Otash tapes are to be believed, then some of the secrets she had threatened to reveal at her press conference have finally come to light.